begin again. It's been wonderful being here and feeling the energy in this room. Thank you, Professor Kim. It's been great meeting you again, and Professor Lee. The assistance rendered by Jean Rowe and Eileen Park has been very valuable. Thank you for inviting me to this prestigious 11th EGEP. It has been an honor to be part of it. I want to start with the question of gender equality. Gender equality as one of the foundational guarantees of our constitutions. It's not just the Indian Constitution. I think many constitutions in the world guarantee that. And therefore, I would like to see gender equality within the context of civil liberties. One of our first social movements was the movement against the emergency in 1975, when civil liberties in India were suspended. And it is at this time that the awareness of the importance of gender equality comes also into play. So what's interesting is that the civil liberties and gender equalities, in a sense, are twinned at birth, at least in the second wave of the women's movement. So when we look at gender equality, please see it in this context. I would like to briefly dwell on a working definition of feminism. We have heard the word so often before, but what does it signify? Feminism is a system of thought that interrogates patriarchal structures in society and opposes the subordination of one gender to the other. So it could be the male gender in a future era, it could be the female gender that is suppressing the other gender. So I would like to leave the definition open, but we know historically that it was women who was the repressed gender. So one very important case that actually was very important for the Indian women's movement was the Mathura rape case of 1979, where a young girl was raped by two policemen in a police station. And the Supreme Court of India, the highest court in the land, said that this girl was not raped because there were no marks of violence on her body. So it raised the question of consent. The judges said, she had consented to the sexual act. But feminists and others disagreed. They said consent cannot be defined like that. It cannot be consent if two policemen pick up a girl, take her to the police station, and rape her. It cannot be, because even the very circumstances of that act is not consent. So, in a sense, these were the early questions that were raised by the women's movement. And there was a lot of mobilization. This is a 1979-1980 photograph. And even in those days, women came out on the streets saying that you cannot, please review this judgment. Slowly, the understanding grew that this crime goes beyond rape. That there was a realization that Indian women's activism needed to take note of a broader gender-based violence. And that's why our Ewha course is also called gender-based violence, which is a broader term than just rape. This was because such violence is not a one-event issue. It is part of a continuum of acts, practices, and beliefs that take place both in the private domain and in the public domain, within the family and amongst strangers. It is difficult to categorize this, but it is there. GBV, they also realized, was sometimes difficult to recognize and categorize. Sometimes social practices make it invisible. For instance, in India, we still don't have a recognition of marital rape. Now, that is because under the idea of marriage is that a woman is the property of her husband and he can do what he wills with her. So once you have that normalization of such behavior, lack of questioning of such behavior, then it becomes invisible to people who are experiencing and society in general. So, and the other big insight is that this issue is not that of the woman alone. It is actually a measure of social apathy that these issues take place. Now you see this woman laden in gold. She is going to be handed over to her husband very shortly. Now, this is the practice of dowry, which is common to many societies in our region. And yesterday I went to the Folk Museum of Korea, and I realized that even in Korea, traditionally, this practice existed, as it does in so many other countries. Now, this practice actually is reflective of the nature of family, the patriarchal nature of family today. And what's interesting is that dowry as an issue did not come up before people till people realized that in India we were talking about many young women committing, so-called committing suicide. It was because they were stove deaths. They were just dying. So it needed women's activism of that day, that is in the early 80s, to say that no, these women are being killed or they're being forced to commit suicide because the pressure of dowry put on them. So in a sense, this reflects the patriarchal family, and many people have looked at it and studied it closely. The family was seen as a crucial factor in creating and maintaining patriarchy. And in India we have caste. So it is responsible for caste because you can't marry outside your community. So marriage is a very important symbol of your caste status in an arranged marriage. And social conservatives. So it was a marker. And the family needed to be looked at. And one of our greatest philosophers, Dr. Amartya Sen, also talked about a very interesting phenomenon that Indian families had, and that is the son preference and daughter dispreference, which again I know in Korea too there was this validation, but I believe Korea has been able to fight this practice much better than India. And the problem in India is that we are losing our daughters. Our sex ratio is very negative for women. And it is growing as families become smaller. Families prefer to make to choose the sex of the child they have. So they go in for sonography and ultrasound technologies in order to decide which child to abort. So the Indian state, I mean, this is outside the script. I'm just talking to you because it's a very important phenomenon, and I think we are going to hear more of it from other people in the course of the 11th program. But basically, I would like to translate it, just do a gist of family, the patriarchal family. So among the problems that were unearthed was that of the domestic violence, and breaking the silence of it meant that we also had new laws, which allowed two things. One is it recognized that the problem existed. Two, it made provisions for the woman who is attacked, including the right of residence, of living in the husband's family, if she so chooses, in a protected way. Because the problem was that those who were subject to domestic violence had no place to go. So they would bear that beating that they got because they had no option. But by giving them options, the law recognized that you will be empowering them. Unfortunately, the law is there in the statute books. It's very difficult to translate it into real life. But the efforts are there. The law is an important consensus in society that we need We need such protection for women. So far, we have been looking at the activities of what is known as the second wave of the feminist movement. But the thing is, from the 90s onwards, a lot of changes happened in India. For one thing, the economy was liberalized, and as a result, global funds started flowing in, and things started changing. Besides which, a new generation had emerged who had different experiences from the older generation. They were also influenced by new philosophers and new feminist theory, like that of Judith Butler. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but she was the one who argued that don't look at gender as male, female, look at them as fluid categories. You can be male-like and you can be female-like, depending on the situation, the structure of your body, the age of your body. I mean, the things are very different, and to see them in fixed ways are in fact not recognizing the complexities that mark them. This was one, and then we had a concept called intersectionality, which said that looking at women only will not give you answers to understand their unique situations. You have to see different aspects of their life. For instance, a poor woman would have a different experience to a rich woman, and therefore it is important to bring other categories into the frame. So it's not just women as a universal category, but intersectionality was brought into the picture. So you look at black, poor women, or black, white, Norwegian women who are gay, and so on. So you bring different categories and try and understand their realities through that prism. So what came into the conversation now was sexualities as well, and the gender, gay rights, and so on became part of the women's movement. So it's interesting that the women's movement was actually mothered or fathered so many different tendencies. And it is a tribute to the women's movement in many ways, that it was open-ended and it allowed different manifestations of such activism. And many of these activisms existed side by side. It didn't mean that one replaced the other. Very often you have different types of activism that were conformed to the second wave type of issues, because those issues have not gone away, and took on the forms and expressions of the third wave, feminism. So that's the interesting thing to note about it. But before we go to the translator, I want to quickly tell you that this new vocabulary that came out was very interesting. A fresh vocabulary came into the frame. It was not the raped woman who had been dishonored, but larger society. It was not the woman who had been shamed, but a criminal justice system and the political establishment that cannot guarantee security and justice is to be shamed. It was no longer the victim, but the survivor. So, I mean, the ways in which words were used were also changed. And what was private space, all the problems of the private space was recognized, but we also recognized that the public space there are a lot of problems with that, because the public space is taking away our right to free movement. It's taking away our right to bodily integrity, that we can live and without being attacked, is a cardinal possibility, of realizing what we are capable of. If I'm scared and I can't move, then how can I'm just a vegetable. You see, so, I mean, the realization that the public space must be made our space was a new insight that came into the frame. No incident in contemporary India reflected this disempowerment of a woman in a public space more tellingly than the gang rape of a 23-year-old physiotherapy student, Jyoti Singh, in in a bus in South Delhi on December 16, 2012. Now, all of us are familiar with this story because of I would say, two important reasons. One, of course, was the brutality of the attack on her. They used rods and iron rods and things, and they, her tummy was perforated, her internal organs were in a complete mess. And the chilling aspect of it was, of course, one of the reasons. The other, I would argue, was because of the feminist activism of the period. It ignited a certain public outrage. So sometimes it's very interesting. Theory, knowledge building, such as Women's Studies Department, and activism come together in very different ways and change the public perceptions in very important ways. And that's why I think women's studies is a subject that is sometimes not given the importance it should get. And that's why I think programs like this are so important, because it's making networks on these issues. So, because it has a direct impact on society. As one feminist noted, there has been an emergence of a public in solidarity which had inspired, provoked, and supported each one of us in our determined fight against sexual violence anywhere in the country. So there was a coming together of people. The active participation of men in large numbers in such counter-mobilizations was conspicuous. One commentator saw it as a turning point wherein women's issues had transitioned into gender issues. Another argued that it was Jyoti's desire to change her life, the girl who was attacked, to change her life for the better that resonated with the crowd, because she was making a fundamental political demand, the right to social mobility, both A, in the literal sense of being able to be on the streets irrespective of the time of day or gender, and B, in the social sense of being able to change the circumstances of her life. In many ways, these protests had two ways of response. While the political establishment and sections of the media argued that the only way sexual violence could be addressed was through protecting women, a protectionist regime. We need more surveillance, more policing. We need control, more control, over women. But feminist activists argued that what was needed was really Bevkov Azadi, that is, fearless freedom. That's what they wanted, fearless freedom. That specifically challenged the approach that sought to control women in the name of their own safety, and used the fear of rape to justify surveillance and restrictions on women's freedom. In many ways, such a perspective drew from earlier feminist campaigns that had challenged in creative ways precisely such ways of control. In 2011, there was a Beshwami Morcha, translating as March of the Shameless, which attempted to systematically counter the socially constructed image of the Indian woman as a demure figure who does not go out of the house, who does what her husband tells her. By deliberately adopting stances designed to outrage conservative sentiments, it was the new generation's response to the manner in which women in the country had been confined and regulated, even as they were, as one commentator put it, routinely stigmatized, medicalized, sexualized, maimed, stalked, harassed, raped, burnt, or killed. It was their way of reclaiming their rights to equality, even if it meant inviting the charge of being shameless by a society controlled by powerful conservatives. So one of the movements was called Why Loiter movement. And one of the people behind its theorists, one of the theorists, put it this way. She said that the feminist conception of women in public spaces is putting risk and pleasure about safety and protection. Violent attacks against women in public space, she argued, and that's Shilpa Phadke I'm quoting. Violent acts against women in public space, she argued, stem from women's lack of claim to the public space and contributes to reducing women's access to public space. So the less we are there in the public space, the more we are attacked. So we have to claim our space in the public. The best long-term strategy for women, therefore, was to engage even more with the city by making their public presence visible, thus taking the feminist engagement with cities a step forward. City space in this reading was viewed not through the prism of safety, but through the prism of equality and inclusion. And what's interesting is that there's a similar movement among young college students who said that we don't want regulations that control our ins and outs. We should be given, the kind of freedom that is given to our male students as well. So very interesting kinds of mobilizations happened as a result of this. But there's also a realization that we are living in very complex times, and that one of the ways in which violence is manifesting itself is in a new scene altogether. Many of you as young people using the net would be familiar with this. And that is, of course, cyber violence. I don't know if you understand what it means, but gender-based violence continues to be widely prevalent in India. And what we found was that in 2013, the Internet Democracy Project interviewed 17 Indian women who were active on the Internet. Many revealed that they had been at the receiving end of not just sexualized slurs, threats of rape, gang rape, which is pretty routine now, but death threats and threats on children and mothers and all kinds of things, just to make your life insecure. According to media watchers, countering the false belief that online harm isn't real because the internet itself isn't real, we need to realize the internet is real in many ways, and what happens there does affect our lives. So we have to understand what happens there. But how do we do that? Do we understand it just by moving out of this? This we know, most of the users of social media and social media technologies and communication technologies tend to be men. But does that mean that women should not also get onto the space, understand it? Of course not. It means understanding it and learn to, it means understanding its various aspects. Now, the latest, which we know as virtual reality, and virtual reality means that you can even be groped in a game. So gaming now has groping. So these are the new ways by which the old attacks on women continue. But that's why a new generation has to take it up and understand what it means to fight it. And I will, this will be my last slide. I would like to end in a positive note, because I think we have moved from the days when we were scared. Fear used to guide us, not anymore. Now, understanding must guide us. And I think that is the point here is that women should not retreat into themselves regarding new technologies as something men have created and continue to shape, and therefore disengage with new spaces of human interaction or demand heavy censorship of online content. Instead, they should arm themselves with information and knowledge about the dangers that exist and go on to organize against them in various ways. My last thought, which I leave with you, is the impunity that marks the actions of the perpetrators of sexual harassment reflect in the final analysis, the patriarchal nature of social conditioning and the masculinization of the social space. This continues to be the dominant reality of Indian society, and I dare say in many of our societies today. But the struggle against it continues. The breakthroughs mentioned here are but chinks, small gaps in that wall of patriarchy. Letting in, if you look through those chinks, we see tantalizing glimpses of a world that is possible. An equal world, one that is gender-centric and empowering. Building international and national solidarities and sharing knowledge like we are doing today are experiences that could bring that wall down. Thank you for your patience.
네, 감사합니다.